What's up everyone, welcome to this video. In this video I'm going to be talking about how we can use SQLAlchemy with AsyncIO. So this basically will help you to work with frameworks that are asynchronous, and you may be able to access the different methods or attributes that may be required in an asynchronous project, or let's say when you're required to use async await syntax. So without further ado, let us get started. So right here in my code, I have two modules. One is the connect core module, and the other is going to be the ORM module. So what I have is two modules in which I've already defined the type of data that we want in our database. In the first one, I have a simple user table right here, and in the second one, I have two tables, one being the user table as well as one being the comment table. Now these are defined using the ORM approach, while this is defined by using the SQLAlchemy core way. Now what you're going to do here is basically go ahead and use AsyncIO to connect to the database as well as do other basic CRUD functions. I hope you get to learn from this video, and let's get into it. So the first thing I did was to go ahead and install the packages which are in my virtual environment right here. I already have them in my basic requirements.txt file right here, but I did not walk you through the installation process. So how I install this is by basically, so I'm just going to write a very simple comment right here. So all these were installed with pip install, and then what I basically did was to say pip install AsyncIO, and then I also installed, since I'm using SQLite, I'm using IO SQLite to connect to the SQLite database. So you may also need to install that with pip install IO SQLite. So this is going to be in a comment just if you need it. What I actually did is pip install SQLAlchemy. I wonder what's wrong with me today, so please bear with me. So what I did was to install SQLAlchemy with the AsyncIO extensions as well as IO SQLite, which is basically the driver or the dialect that will help us to connect to SQLite using AsyncIO. Now this will vary. If you're using Postgres, then you'll be using async. So this will be async PG for Postgres. So this will be for Postgres. And if you're using MySQL, then you may be using something like async MySQL. So this is going to be async MySQL. So go ahead and run this. So this is going to be pip install SQLAlchemy, and then you'll install AsyncIO extensions as well as IO SQLite for basically the dialect or the driver for your database. This is going to be for Postgres, and this will be for MySQL. So the first thing we're going to do is to create a connection to our database. So I'm going to cover the core part first. And what we need is some sort of coroutine that will run with asynchronous IO. So the first thing I'm going to do is to import AsyncIO. So I'll go at the top right here and say import AsyncIO. So this is the way Python allows us to run asynchronous functions. And the way we run an asynchronous function is basically by calling the AsyncIO.run function. So what we need to do is to define some sort of coroutine that will be run by this call of the run function. So what we're going to do is to go ahead and define where we're going to run our async code. So what we have to do is to define that coroutine. So this coroutine is going to be a function that's going to be defined with async and then def. And in this case, we shall also name the function. So I'm going to call this async main. So I'll pass this for now, and this is where we shall write most of the code we are going to write for our video. So once I've defined this, then inside our run, I'm going to go ahead and call this function. So this is not going to run normally, but it will run in an asynchronous fashion. So that means all the code that we need to run is going to be defined right here. Now in SQLAlchemy, for us to connect to the database, we need some sort of engine. So if I were to connect with SQLAlchemy using AsyncIO, then what we need is an asynchronous engine object. Luckily for us, in the SQLAlchemy extension for AsyncIO, we get an alternative to the create engine function, which is basically the create async engine function. So let's go ahead and first import it. So what I'm going to do is to go at the top right here. And what I'll do is to say from SQLAlchemy.ext.asyncio, then we're going to go ahead and import the various things that we shall need to work with our database using AsyncIO. So this is basically going to first of all give us the create async engine function. And once we've imported it, then what we're going to do is to go where we have our async main function. And what we shall do is to first of all define our engine. So this engine is going to be a call to our create async engine function. Now this works similar to how we have the create engine function when using SQLAlchemy synchronously. So what we shall have to do here is to go ahead and define the URL to our database. So this is going to vary when you're using SQLite or MySQL or Postgres or Oracle. But since I'm using SQLite, I'll basically provide SQLite. And now we also need to basically provide the dialect or the driver, which we installed as IO SQLite. So this is basically the driver right here. If you're connecting to Postgres, this will be async PG. MySQL is going to be async MySQL. So what I'm going to do is to go ahead and say SQLite plus, and in this case, I'll say MySQL. And in this case, I'll define where our database will be. So this is going to be found within our current folder. And then we shall have simple, or let me call it sample.db. So once we've been able to do that, the next thing I'm going to provide is going to be our echo attribute, which is basically going to allow us to access some SQL to be logged when we are carrying out different things to our database. So in this case, I'll come and say echo is going to be equal to true. And once we've been able to do that, now we can go ahead and create or establish a connection to our database. So for us to do that, I'm going to go ahead and write down here, I'll start by creating a context manager. Now, the beauty is when dealing with asynchronous SQLAlchemy, what you have to do is to use an async await syntax for us to be able to basically carry out almost everything. So even if I'm using a context manager such as with, then all I have to use is async and then with. And whatever I have to call, so in this case, it's going to be engine.begin, which is basically going to allow us to create our connection by allowing us to return a context manager, which will provide for us that specific connection. So we can basically call this with async and then engine.begin. Then we shall call this our connection object. So I'll say with it being our connection, then what you're going to do is to run our meta.createAll. Remember, we're using our users table object right here, which is basically relying on a metadata object for it to create its schema. So if we want to do that, to create our table, then what we need to do is to run meta.createAll. But since this is going to be a synchronous function, then what we need to do is to run it, but with AsyncIO. So the way we do that is by basically saying await. Then in this case, we shall call our connection object. Then we shall run dot run, and this is going to give us access to the run sync function. So the run sync function is necessary in a way that it is going to help us to invoke a given asynchronous callable or synchronous function. In this case, that synchronous function is going to be one for creating our database object. So that's going to be meta, which is our metadata object right here. And in this case, shall say dot create all. So that will be enough for us to be able to create our database object or our user table structure within our database. So I'm going to add a simple comment here, and this is going to be create database. So once you've been able to do this, then the next thing we shall need to do is to go ahead and insert some data into our table. So for us to do that, then the next thing we're going to do is to insert some data into our table. So this is going to be into our table. Then for us to be able to do this, then we are also going to make use of our connection object by inserting some columns into our database. So the way we're going to do that is by basically using await, then we shall use our connection object, then we shall call our execute function or method. And what this is going to allow us is to execute a certain statement. Now the beauty is when using a table object just like the one we have here, we can basically go ahead and call users table dot, in this case we shall basically go ahead and call some statements. So in this case, shall just say insert, and I'll provide the different data that we may need to insert into this table. So provide a bunch of dictionaries. Now let me put this on a new line. So the first dictionary we're going to have is going to have some user data. So let me remove this. So in here, we're going to provide a user. So the different fields that will come on the user table are the username, the email, as well as the bio. So we're going to go right here and then provide our username. And this username, the first username we're going to provide here is going to be Jonah123. Then we shall also need to have an email. So I'm also going to put this in quotes. Then the value of the email is going to be Jonah123, let's say app.com. And then this is also going to have a bio. So the bio of this user will be, let's say, really cool guy. So Jonah is a real cool guy. So in this case, I'll just say really cool guy. Or we can even choose to put this on a new line so that you guys can see very well. So this is the first user we've inserted into our database. So we can go ahead and maybe add another user. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that object, put it here. And then what I'll do is to go ahead and add another user. So what I'll do is to just change some data right here. So instead of Jonah, we may add Jerry and save. So once we have this, then maybe I can change this. So I'll just say, let's say subscribe to the channel. So once we have this, then this will be enough for us to go ahead and insert this data into our database. So once this is done, then we may need to also run other tasks. So in here, what we've been able to do is to establish our connection object, but we can also go ahead and basically connect to our database in case we want to run some statements. Now let's go ahead and do that. So what we've been doing here is to basically establish our connection with engine.begin. So we just basically connected, and once we've connected, then we went ahead and created our database table. Then after creating our database table, then the next thing is to insert some data inside here. So let's go ahead and also be able to run some select statements just like we're going to do down here. So what you're going to do here is to go ahead and basically run some select statements. So we're just going to run some select. So for us to do that, I'm going to go right here, and all I have to do is to basically define another asynchronous call. So this is going to be async connection. So I'm actually going to work within our with statement. So in this case, I'll just come and say async with, and in this case, what I'll do is to basically call our engine. So instead of engine.begin, we can now call engine.connect to basically create our connection after basically creating our database. So in this case, I basically call this as our connection object. Now, in this case, what we need to do is to come up with some statement we may want to run. So I may say statement is going to be equal to. So let's just carry out a simple select statement. So I hope I've imported the select statement here. So I'll just come and say that we're going to select from our users table. So I'll just come and say select from my users table. So shall call aware close right here. And we want to select where our username is basically some name. So in this case, shall maybe say users table dot column dot, and in this case we are going to call our username column. So in this case we shall say user table dot c, which is the attribute that will allow us to access our column name, which is username. In this case we want to search for that user who is called Jonah13 or 123. I think I called him 123. So once you have this, then this statement is going to be executed within our connection object. So the way we're going to do that is by basically creating a variable called result, and this result is going to be an await statement. So in this case we're going to await con dot execute, and in this case we are basically going to say we're going to execute our statement. So in this case we shall just come and call our statement. So if we want to access these results, then all we need to do is to maybe say print, and in this case what I'll have to do is to say result dot, so this will basically return all of the results that will have that specific username. So in this case, if we go ahead and run our code, so if we look into our code, what we did was to connect to our database, insert some data into our database, and what we're doing now is to basically go ahead and be able to select or retrieve the user with this specific username. So if I pull up my terminal right here and I run Python, so this is going to be our connect core.py. In this case, we're having an error, so we cannot basically load the plugin for SQLAlchemy MySQL. So let's see. So what you have here is, this is actually SQLite, which is IO SQLite. Sorry for the mistake right here. So what I'm going to do is to go ahead and run. And now we see that it's going to go ahead and create our database, just like you see right here. So we see that it's loading the table information and then creating our database table, which is right here. So we see that it's also going ahead to insert these users into our table, just like you see right here. So even when we try to run our select, it will still run, and we see that the user who is being returned is the user with the username that we specified right here, which is Jonah123. So for us to confirm whether this is right, I'm going to pull up my DB browser for SQLite, which is right here, and then I'll go and navigate to where our database is. So it's right here, and we now see that both our users have been inserted, which is really cool. So now that we've been able to run some basic CRUD function, we've been able to insert as well as able to retrieve. Basically what happens is, in case we want to maybe update and delete, then all that will be done within our async main function, and then AsyncIO will go ahead and run our table. So now let's go ahead and run and learn how to connect to our database, as well as to create our database tables in our database, but by using our ORM. Another important question may be, why or how can we be able to close our connection in case we've been able to connect to our SQLAlchemy using AsyncIO? So what happens is, we are provided with a method that we call that is going to help us to close our connection after connecting to our database using SQLAlchemy and AsyncIO. And that method is going to be the dispose method. So if we want to access that dispose method, what we shall have to do within our coroutine, which is async main right here, I'm just going to go ahead and call await, and using our engine object, which is our async engine object, I'll just come and say await engine.dispose. And when we call this, what we basically see is that it has one attribute, which is the close, actually an argument, which is the close argument. So when you call this with Boolean, without setting the close attribute, what we're basically saying is we are closing the connection, and we have to create another connection in case we want to access our database again. But if we set this to false, then that means our connection is not going to die, and our connection will still be available for us to use in case we want to use it to access our database. So now that we've been able to look at that, let's go ahead and look at how we can use SQLAlchemy ORM with AsyncIO to basically carry out or manage our database. So let's go ahead and look at our orm.py module right here. So within our orm.py module right here, what we have is basically a simple database structure. What we have is our base class, which is inheriting from declarative base, and it's going to allow us to create our database models. So our database models all inherit from this base class that is created right here, and we have defined some sort of relationship between these two tables. Now the next thing we're going to do is for us to connect to the database, create these tables, and then be able to carry out some sample SQL queries, or basically query and insert some data, update, or maybe even delete some data from our database. So let's get started. Now for us to begin, it is not going to be so different from how we did it in the core. All we have to do is to have one central point, which is going to be our core routine. And with this core routine, we shall create our connection, create our session, because now we are dealing with ORM, which entirely depends on our session objects for us to interact with our database. So if we go right where we have our models, after our models, what I'll do is to go ahead and define our, so in this case, I'm going to go ahead and define our async main. So this, you can call this whatever you want. So async main is going to be the name of the core routine, and we shall pass this for now. So in order for us to run this core routine, then we shall need AsyncIO. So I'll go at the top right here and say import AsyncIO, and after importing AsyncIO, then we are going to go ahead and run this core routine with AsyncIO.run. So right after being able to call AsyncIO.run, then we shall need to provide the core routine to run, which is going to be our async main core routine. So right after we've been able to do that, then the next thing is going to be for us to go ahead and create our engine. So this engine is very important, that is, as it will allow us to create a connection to our database. So for us to do that, what I'll do is to go ahead and import what we need, which is going to be our create async engine function. So I'm just going to come and say from SQLAlchemy.ext.AsyncIO import create async engine, and once we've imported create async engine, then we shall come right here in our core routine, and in here what I have to do is to basically create the engine, or our async engine. So shall just basically come and say that our engine is going to be equal to a call to our create async engine, and in here we shall go ahead and provide our URL to our database, which is going to be SQLite and then plus the dialect. So that's going to be IO SQLite. So right after doing that, then shall go ahead and provide the path to our database. Now I'll call our database sample2.db, and once I've been able to do that, then the next thing is going to be for me to go ahead and basically call echo and set it to true. So I'll say echo, or I'll set the echo attribute to true, so that you can be able to see any SQL that will be available when querying the database. The next thing we're going to do is to create our session object, and this session object will allow us to basically interact with our database. So for us to create it, then we shall have to go ahead and import our session maker class that's going to be able to help us to create these objects. So I'll come at the top right here. So let me put this on a new line. So I'll use this parentheses, and then I'll say that we shall have our async session maker, and this async session maker will basically allow us to go ahead and basically create our sessions. So I'm just going to come right here, and all I have to do is to go ahead and create our session. So this is going to be create a session, and here we shall basically have our session, and this session is going to be a call to our async session maker class. So once we have this, then we shall have to bind it to our engine. So I'll say bind is going to be equal to the engine object that we've created at the top right there. And then we shall also set another important attribute. So this attribute is going to be expire on commit, which will allow us to or prevent us from deleting our objects or our model objects in case we've been able to successfully commit to our database. So in this case, we shall say expire on commit, and then we shall set this to false. So once we've been able to do this, then the next thing is going to be for us to basically create a connection to our database. So we shall say async with, just like we did for the previous example of our core. So in this case, we shall say with engine dot begin as our connection. So this is actually a call to a function. So I'll add the parentheses. So what we need to do is to run our database creation. So in this case, we shall call, since this is asynchronous, shall say await connection dot run synchronous. So we shall have to call this which is basically base.metadata.create all, and the explanation for this is that base.metadata.create all is synchronous. So shall just basically come in here and say base.metadata.create all, and this will be just enough for us to create our database. So this is where we shall create our DB tables. So once we've been able to do this, now let's try to run and see what is going to happen. So I'll save and pull up our terminal right here. So if you run Python, it's actually going to be Python orm.py. So it's going to be orm.py. So forgive me, I'm a bit tired. So if we say Python orm.py, then we shall see that this will go ahead and create both our user table as well as our comments table, just like you see right here. So once we've been able to create our table, now let's try to go ahead and insert some data into our database. So for us to do that, then what I'm going to do is to go ahead and maybe separate the code so that we have things being a little bit organized. So I'm going to separate the logic for inserting our data and other queries I'll carry out into different coroutines that we shall call within our main coroutine right here. So I'm going to begin with inserting data. So I'll leave a comment right here and then say insert data. And in here, what I have to do is to say async. So this will be an asynchronous function. So I'm just going to call this async insert data. And what I may need here is going to be a session maker object. So what I'll do is to go ahead and say that our session maker object is going to be one that's going to be of a type of async session maker, and then I'll also give it a type of async session. So what I'm going to do is to come and say that this will be of type async session maker, and then I'll also import the async session. So this is basically type hints, and I want to access a session maker within this so that I create a session. So I'll have to import the session class, the async session class. So to do that, I'll just come and say async session. And once I've been able to do that, then I'll just come right here and then I'll go ahead and specify that this will be of type async session. So once I've been able to do this, then I'll just come right down here and then I'll create a with statement, but this is going to be an async with. So just say with async with. In this case, I'll try to access our session maker. So in this case, I'll say session maker as session. This is actually going to be our session. Then in here, we shall also begin our session. So we shall say with session dot, in this case, we shall access all these methods. So in this case, we shall say with session dot begin then what we're going to do is to insert various objects into our database. So for us to do that, we're going to begin by, so this is actually also going to be async with, I don't know why I forget this, so I'll just also say async with session dot begin. So it's actually going to be async with session dot begin, and then in here we shall say session. It's actually going to be async instead of await. Sorry, you'll forgive me, I'm a bit tired. So this will be async with session dot begin, and in here we shall say async session dot add, and then in here we want to add a variety of objects, so I'll say add all. And one thing we're going to do is to basically create multiple objects and then add data into those objects. So the first thing we shall do is to create a list, and this list is going to have various data objects. So I may say this is going to be a list, and we shall have user objects in here. So each user will have a username. So let's say basing on the user class that's basically created here to create these attributes. So I'll just say that our username is going to be, let's say, Jonah123, and then our email right here is going to be equal to, let's say, Jonah123@app.com, and then we may have the bio. So the bio in this case is going to be equal to, let's say, really cool guy. And then let's say we wanted to have some list of comments, so we shall say comments, and in here we can have comment objects. So we're going to basically say that each comment is going to have comment text. So if you're wondering how I'm coming up with this is already defined right here. So each comment is going to have comment text and it's going to be associated with the user, and that's why we have this list of comments right here in our user object. So let's say in here we shall say please like the video. So in this case I'll say please like the video, and then I'll also add another comment. So this is also going to be another comment. So I'll just basically go ahead and copy what we have here, and then I'll paste it right here. So in here we shall have our comment text being please like the video, and this is going to also be please subscribe. So it's going to be please subscribe and please subscribe. I have a goal of reaching 10k subscribers, so it will be helpful. Yeah. So right after doing that, then what I'll do is to go ahead and add another user object. So let's say we're going to add another user, and this user is going to basically go ahead and add these attributes. So I'll add these attributes and I'll change the name. So instead of Jonah123, let's say we are going to make this, let's say, Gloria123, and yeah, Gloria. Let's say this Gloria is going to be a really cool girl. So I'll just add really cool girl. So I'm going to go ahead and save. And one thing we want to do here is after adding all these objects, then we need to basically go ahead and commit them to our database. So for us to commit them to our database, then we shall just come here and say session dot commit. So once you've been able to do this, then we shall be able to finally save these objects into our database table. So for us to do that, what I'm going to go ahead and do is to go right here. So we do not need to create our tables again. I'll just comment what we have here, and then I'll just come right here and say await insert. So this is going to be insert data, and then we shall need our session object. So in this case, I'll just come and say that we shall need our async session. So just come and provide our async session object, which is actually called session. So I'll just come and say session, and once we provided this session object, then that will be enough for us to be able to create or add data into our database. Now, if we pull up our terminal and try to run Python orm.py, so this is going to be orm.py. So we now see that all this data is going to be inserted into our database. Now let's go ahead and explore this. So what I'm going to do is to first of all open up our data with DB browser for SQLite. So I'll pull it up right here. Then I'll say open database. So I'll basically navigate where I put the data. So put it in users, and then I put it in OpenAPI stuff, OpenAI stuff. So this is sample2.db. If I open it up, then we are going to have both our comments and users tables. If we try to browse the data, we shall see that our comments are being inserted. And if we go to our users right here, we shall now see that our users are also inserted with their respective information. So that's basically how we can be able to basically create a connection, insert data, and be able to see the data that we've inserted into our table. Now let's look at some other quite things we can do onto our database tables using our session object or our async session object. So I'm going to basically close this for now, and what I'll do is to go ahead and create another coroutine. So in here, I'm just going to come and add another coroutine. Now that has been one for basically inserting data. And now I'm going to add one for basically selecting, retrieving, and updating. So let's say we're going to select, retrieve, and then maybe update an object. So in this case, I may say selecting, updating, and maybe deleting. So in this case, I'll say deleting, or let's just basically do selecting and updating. So I may say async and def. In this case, we shall basically say that I want to select, update, and then this one will also be the same. So I'll copy what we have in here. And the purpose of doing this is to basically make it easy for me to access all these attributes when I'm coding. So don't take it serious, but still it's important because it's the way that you can easily access all these attributes. So I'm just going to copy this, and when I come right here, I'll paste it here. And what I'll do is to come right here, and all I have to do is to basically begin accessing my object. So I just basically come and say with session maker, with the call to our session maker being, so this is basically going to be our session. With it being our session, then we are going to use it to select. So I'll just basically create a simple statement right here that's going to allow us to select. So we shall basically call our select function. If you're wondering where this came from, it came directly from SQLAlchemy. So from SQLAlchemy, import select. So if we select, then I'm just simply going to come and provide our select user. Then in here we can basically carry out .where, and then we shall basically query for the user who has the username of, let's say, the username is equal to, let's say, Gloria123, and then we are going to use our session to execute this. So what I'm going to do is to say result is going to be equal to session, and this will be our session.execute. So shall basically call session.execute, and in here we shall call our statement. So once we have this, then the next thing is going to be for us to access the result. So for us to access the result, then all you have to do is to maybe say print result dot all. So in here we can basically get access to our results. So if we do that, then let's try to run this. So if we come right here, and maybe instead of inserting data, let me comment this out. And what we want to do is to say await, let's say select, and this is going to be select update, and it's also going to take in our session. So if we try to run this, then we are going to basically go ahead. I think there is something wrong with my camera, so let me try to work on something here. All right, so when we continue this, then we can now run our Python. So I'm going to clear my terminal with Ctrl and L, And what I'll do is to now run this with select update so that we see our result being returned. So if I pull up my terminal and run python orm.py, we now see that async session object does not support context manager protocol. I think we did this with session maker as session, so let's see where that is. So it does not support context manager protocol. So this is async session. I think we're supposed to do it the same way we did for inserting. So we needed something like async with. So what I'm going to do is to change that. So if we come right here and say async with session maker as session, so this will be async with session maker as session, and then we have our statement. So we go ahead and execute this. So we still have coroutine was never awaited, so that means we have to call await session.execute. I don't know why I'm forgetting this. So we now see that this is going to run and it will return for us the user who is Gloria 123. So this is basically working just like we expected. So we can go ahead and maybe update this user. So if we want to update this user, we can basically call result dot, let's say result.1. So this will basically return for us the only user instead of a list. So now we see that this is returning the method. So if we call it with parentheses, then we expect it's going to return only that user object, which is the user Gloria, the one that we see right here. So if you want to basically be able to access or be able to basically call this with maybe access the specific user, then you can maybe do result.scalars and then .1. So this will be able to help us. So if you run this, so it seems like we do not have scalars. Well, this is actually going to be .scalars.1, which is also a function of its own. So I think that's a mistake I did. So if we clear this and then run, shall now say that we're accessing the individual object, which is Gloria 123. So once we have that, then we can maybe go ahead and store it. So one thing I can do is to maybe go and say that what we can do is to say result.scalars.1, which is the individual object. So once we get access to the individual object, then we can maybe update that result. So when we come here, we can say that our user is going to be result.scalars.1, and then we can go ahead and update that user. So we can do something like user dot, and then in this case, we can access our username. So we can access our username, update it by saying maybe user.username, and this is going to be equal to, let's say, Gloria 345. So if we save and then use our session to commit this, so we can say session dot commit. This is basically saving our user. So if we go ahead and run this, then we expect it's going to go ahead and commit. So right white here, so we see that this was never awaited, which means it never ran. So if we want to commit this, maybe we can just come and say await session.commit. I wonder why I'm forgetting this. So let's go ahead and run this. So if we go ahead and run, when we basically check our SQL right here, we see that it's first of all selecting the user Gloria, which is being returned right here. And then we are going ahead and setting the username for that user Gloria to Gloria345. So let's go ahead and try to basically make sense of this. So if we go right to our DB browser for SQLite and we refresh, we now see that Gloria's name is being changed from Gloria123 to Gloria345, which is actually working. We can also go ahead and delete this object. So deleting this object will be as simple as basically going ahead to maybe say session.delete. So we can just make use of session.delete. So we can say await and then say session.delete. And then in here, we shall provide our instance, which is going to be our user. So if we try to run our code right here, then so now no result was found. So we now do not have any user with that specific name of Gloria123. So if we wanted to delete, then we would need to delete the one with Gloria345. So if we go ahead and run, we now see that the user has been deleted. So this is basically our delete statement right here. We first begin by selecting that user and then deleting that specific user from our database table. So if we go ahead to confirm with dbbrowser.sqlite, we see that that specific object has been deleted from our database, which is basically straightforward. So I hope I've given you a very good introduction of how to use SQLAlchemy with AsyncIO. And this has been basically one video that I recorded when tired. So I would really appreciate if you leave a like on the video. So I hope you've learned from this video, and I hope to see you in the next video. Please like this video, and don't forget to subscribe if you've landed on my channel for the very first time. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video, probably about SQLAlchemy and any other Python topics. Bye.